Why some prisoners beg to be executed. For most people, death is the thing they fear most. The final moment. The last breath. The end of everything. Yet inside some of the world's harshest prisons, there are inmates who make a shocking request. They ask to die. Not because they are innocent. Not because they believe execution is unjust. But because life behind bars has become something they can no longer endure. Some stop appealing their death sentences. Some volunteer for execution. Others spend years begging courts to let them die. What could possibly make a human being choose death over another day alive? And what happens inside prisons that pushes some inmates to that point? The answer is darker than most people imagine. Before we begin, subscribe for more documentaries exploring crime, prisons, and the realities hidden behind prison walls. And leave a comment sharing where you're watching from. This story is not about innocence or guilt. It is about what happens when punishment becomes a lifetime. And for some prisoners, that lifetime eventually feels worse than death. What you're about to hear has happened in prisons across America and around the world. Some of these men committed terrible crimes. Some destroyed multiple lives. Yet even among society's most hated offenders, there are stories that force difficult questions about human endurance. Because long before an execution chamber is prepared, another battle has often been taking place. A battle inside the prisoner's own mind. And in many cases, that battle is already lost. To understand why some prisoners beg for execution, you first have to understand prison time itself. Most people imagine prison as a place where inmates eventually adapt. A routine develops. Days become predictable. Life continues. For many prisoners, that is partly true. They wake early. They count days. They work prison jobs. They eat at scheduled hours. They exercise. They sleep. Then repeat the cycle again. And again. And again. But maximum security prisons operate differently. Especially for inmates serving life sentences or awaiting execution. Many spend years locked inside tiny cells. Some spend 22 or 23 hours a day alone. Human contact becomes rare. Conversations become limited. Touch almost disappears from daily life. Weeks blur together. Months disappear. Years become difficult to distinguish. Former inmates have described reaching a point where they could no longer remember what freedom felt like. The smell of rain. The feeling of grass beneath their feet. The sound of traffic. The simple ability to open a door whenever they wished. Those memories gradually fade. And what replaces them is often something far more dangerous. Hopelessness. But as devastating as hopelessness can be, what happens next is often even worse. For prisoners serving life without parole, time becomes a unique form of punishment. Every morning begins with the same reality. There is no release date. No second chance. No possibility of going home. The sentence does not end. It simply continues until death arrives naturally. Psychologists have studied inmates serving these sentences for decades. Many describe a phenomenon known as social death. Physically, the prisoner remains alive. Emotionally, many begin to feel disconnected from society itself. Families move on. Friends disappear. Parents die. Children become adults. Entire decades pass beyond prison walls. The world changes while the inmate remains frozen in place. Imagine watching life continue without you. Imagine knowing that no matter how much time passes, your destination never changes. For some inmates, this realization becomes unbearable. Especially after 10, 20, or 30 years. A shocking number eventually conclude that execution would be easier than endless waiting. And this isn't merely a theory. Real prisoners have openly said exactly that. One of the most controversial examples involved death row inmates who voluntarily gave up their appeals. In the United States, individuals sentenced to death often spend years challenging convictions and sentences. Appeals can continue for decades. Lawyers search for errors. Courts review evidence. Execution dates are delayed repeatedly. Many prisoners fight relentlessly to stay alive. But some do the opposite. They instruct attorneys to stop. They reject appeals. They request execution. These inmates are often called volunteers. The term sounds strange. Almost impossible. Yet it has happened numerous times. When courts hear such requests, judges face an uncomfortable question. Is the prisoner making a rational decision? Or has prison itself damaged their mental state so severely that death now appears preferable? The answer is rarely simple. And in some cases, experts disagree completely. What makes these cases so disturbing is that many prisoners understand exactly what execution means. They are fully aware, fully informed. Yet they still choose it. Why? Because years inside certain prison environments can fundamentally alter the way people think about the future. And nowhere is that transformation more visible than on death row itself. Death row is often portrayed as the ultimate punishment. But few people understand how different it can be from ordinary prison housing. In many facilities, death row inmates spend extraordinary amounts of time isolated from others. Security restrictions are intense. Movement is tightly controlled. Every action is monitored. Some prisoners spend decades waiting for an execution date that never arrives. Others receive dates only to see them postponed. Then postponed again. Then postponed once more. Imagine living under a permanent countdown clock. Not knowing whether your execution will happen next year, next month, or 20 years from now. The uncertainty itself becomes part of the punishment. Former death row inmates have described a constant psychological strain. Every unusual noise creates anxiety. Every guard approaching the cell raises questions. Every legal decision carries enormous consequences. Years of that stress can wear down even the strongest minds. For some prisoners, execution eventually begins to feel less frightening than endless anticipation. The waiting becomes its own form of suffering. And once that mindset takes hold, something remarkable can happen. The fear of death starts disappearing. Human beings can survive extraordinary hardship. History proves that. But survival often depends on hope. Hope creates endurance. Hope creates resilience. Hope creates meaning. Remove hope completely, and everything changes. Inside prison, hope can disappear gradually. An appeal fails. A family member stops writing. A friend dies. Years pass without progress. Then another decade follows. Many inmates eventually reach what psychologists call learned helplessness. After repeated failures to change their situation, they stop believing change is possible at all. They no longer plan for the future. They stop imagining different outcomes. Life becomes passive observation. Wake up. Eat. Wait. Sleep. Repeat. Some prisoners have compared it to existing rather than living. And once a person reaches that stage, execution may begin to look less like punishment and more like escape. Not because death becomes attractive, but because endless confinement becomes intolerable. Still, prison conditions alone don't explain every case. Another factor often plays an even larger role. Regret. Many notorious offenders spend years denying responsibility. But others eventually confront what they have done. And for some, that realization becomes devastating. Imagine having decades to think. No distractions. No freedom. No ability to move on. Just time. Time to replay decisions. Time to remember victims. Time to revisit crimes. Time to imagine lives destroyed. Some inmates become consumed by guilt. Former prison psychologists have described prisoners who repeatedly relived their offenses. The memories became impossible to escape. Sleep offered little relief. Neither did isolation. In those situations, death can begin to appear as a form of resolution. A final ending. An end to the psychological burden they carry. Not everyone experiences this. Many offenders remain unrepentant. But those who do confront their actions sometimes face a punishment no prison official can impose. Their own conscience. And as powerful as guilt can be, there is another prison reality that drives some inmates even closer to despair. Violence. Prison violence is not constant everywhere. Many institutions are safer than popular culture suggests. But violence remains a reality in many facilities. Especially among high-security populations. Inmates learn survival rules quickly. Never appear weak. Never interfere in conflicts. Never borrow what you cannot repay. Never disrespect gang structures. Violating these unwritten rules can carry serious consequences. For vulnerable prisoners, daily life can become a continuous state of tension. Every interaction must be calculated. Every conversation measured. Trust becomes dangerous. Some inmates spend years looking over their shoulders. Years expecting conflict. Years anticipating attacks. That constant stress affects the brain. Sleep deteriorates. Anxiety increases. Paranoia develops. Mental health suffers. When combined with decades of confinement, the psychological impact can be enormous. Some prisoners eventually stop seeing a meaningful future. And when that happens, requests for execution become easier to understand. Not acceptable. Not inevitable. But understandable. Yet perhaps the most disturbing factor of all lies inside a place many people never see. Solitary confinement. And what it can do to the human mind. For decades, researchers, former inmates, and correctional experts have debated the effects of long-term isolation. The basic conditions are simple. Very little human interaction. Very limited movement. Extremely restricted environments. Yet the consequences can be profound. Some prisoners report hearing voices. Others describe panic attacks. Many experience depression. Concentration becomes difficult. Memory deteriorates. Time itself begins to feel distorted. Days blend together. Weeks lose meaning. Even individuals with no prior mental illness can struggle under prolonged isolation. Now imagine years of that environment. Not weeks. Not months. Years. In some documented cases, inmates emerged psychologically changed. More withdrawn. More anxious. More emotionally unstable. For certain prisoners, execution eventually appeared less terrifying than continuing life under those conditions. That realization has fueled intense debates among legal scholars, psychologists, and human rights advocates. Because if a prisoner chooses death after decades of isolation, is the choice truly free? Or has the environment itself shaped the decision? There is no universal answer. But the question remains. And it becomes even more troubling when we look at real examples. Throughout modern history, multiple death row inmates have waived appeals and requested execution. Some stated they were exhausted. Others said they had accepted responsibility. Several openly declared they preferred death to endless imprisonment. Their motivations varied. No two stories were identical. Some suffered mental illness. Others appeared psychologically stable. Some expressed remorse. Others did not. But one theme surfaced repeatedly. They could no longer imagine living the rest of their lives behind bars. That statement appears again and again in interviews, court hearings, and prison records. The prison sentence itself had become unbearable. And perhaps that is what makes these cases so unsettling. Because they force society to confront a difficult reality. Punishment is intended to deter, incapacitate, and provide justice. But when prisoners begin requesting their own executions, what exactly are we witnessing? Acceptance? Despair? Mental deterioration? Or something else entirely? The answer depends on who you ask. And the debate continues today. There is another side to this story that often receives less attention. Not every prisoner who begs for execution continues feeling that way forever. Some change their minds. Some rediscover purpose. Some find religion. Others develop meaningful relationships. A few become mentors to younger inmates. Some pursue education. Others write books. Several spend years helping victims' organizations or participating in restorative justice programs where possible. These stories reveal something important. Human beings are capable of change even in the harshest environments. Hope can disappear. But sometimes it returns. Unexpectedly. Quietly. One conversation. One letter. One opportunity. One reason to continue. And when that happens, prisoners who once welcomed death may begin fighting desperately to stay alive. The same person who once requested execution may later fear it intensely. Which reveals another truth. The human mind is not fixed. It evolves. Even behind bars. Faith has played a significant role in many of these transformations. Inside prisons around the world, religious programs often provide structure, meaning, and community. For some inmates, faith offers forgiveness. For others, accountability. Many describe discovering purpose despite confinement. Whether through religion, philosophy, education, or service to others, these inmates develop something they previously lacked. A reason to endure. And that reason can become powerful enough to overcome years of despair. This does not erase crimes. It does not erase victims. But it changes how prisoners view their remaining years. The difference between existing and living often begins with purpose. Without purpose, decades feel impossible. With purpose, even prison life can become bearable. Perhaps that explains why some prisoners seek execution while others continue fighting for life despite impossible circumstances. The difference is not always physical conditions. Sometimes it is meaning. And meaning can be extraordinarily powerful. In the end, the question is not simply why some prisoners beg to be executed. The deeper question is what happens to a human being when hope disappears. Prisons remove freedom. That is their purpose. But when years become decades and decades become a lifetime, the psychological consequences can be immense. Some prisoners adapt. Some grow. Some find purpose. Others collapse beneath the weight of isolation, regret, violence, and endless confinement. And among those individuals, a shocking decision sometimes emerges. They stop fearing death. They start fearing life inside prison more. That reality has appeared throughout modern correctional history. Not because death becomes desirable, but because suffering can eventually reshape how people view survival itself. For many of us, that idea feels impossible to understand. Yet behind steel doors, concrete walls, and razor wire, it has happened repeatedly. And it continues to happen. Long after headlines fade. Long after court cases end. Long after society stops paying attention. Because somewhere tonight, inside a small prison cell, another inmate may be staring at the ceiling. Counting years. Counting losses. counting the distance between the life they once had and the life they have now, and wondering whether tomorrow is something to hope for, or something to escape. That question may be one of the most haunting realities of imprisonment, and it remains unanswered. For prison staff, these moments create a different kind of challenge. Correctional officers are trained to maintain order, enforce rules, and ensure safety. But what happens when an inmate openly states that he wants to die? Not during a moment of anger, not during a crisis, but consistently. For months, sometimes years. Inside many prisons, such statements trigger mental health evaluations. Psychologists and psychiatrists begin asking difficult questions. Is the prisoner suffering from severe depression? Is this suicidal thinking? Or is this a calculated decision made by someone fully aware of the consequences? The distinction matters enormously. Because courts generally cannot execute someone who lacks the mental capacity to understand what is happening. Yet determining mental competence is rarely straightforward. A prisoner can be deeply depressed and still understand reality. A prisoner can suffer immense psychological pain and still make legally rational decisions. This gray area has produced some of the most controversial legal battles in modern criminal justice. And in several cases, experts reviewing the same inmate reached completely opposite conclusions. One psychologist might argue the prisoner is competent. Another might insist years of confinement have distorted the prisoner's judgment beyond recognition. Meanwhile, the prisoner himself sits in a cell waiting for others to decide whether he is allowed to die. The legal system was never designed for situations like this. Normally, courts review appeals because defendants want relief. They want freedom. A reduced sentence. A new trial. Something. But when inmates reject those opportunities, the system faces an unusual dilemma. Should courts force appeals on someone who no longer wants them? Should attorneys continue fighting to save clients who have instructed them to stop? And perhaps most importantly, can society trust decisions made by people who have spent decades in extreme confinement? These questions have generated intense debate. Some legal scholars argue that every possible safeguard should remain in place regardless of the inmate's wishes. Others argue that competent adults should have the right to make decisions about their own cases. There are no easy answers. Every case forces courts to balance autonomy, justice, and mental health. And often, there is no outcome that satisfies everyone involved. But while judges and lawyers debate legal principles, another group experiences these situations in a deeply personal way. The families. When people discuss prison sentences, attention usually focuses on the inmate. Yet every incarceration affects others. Parents, children, siblings, spouses, friends. For family members, hearing that a loved one wants to be executed can be devastating. Some desperately try to persuade the inmate to keep fighting. Others become frustrated after years of emotional exhaustion. Many experience a mixture of grief, anger, confusion, and helplessness. Imagine receiving a phone call from someone you love. A son, a brother, a father. And hearing him calmly explain that he no longer wants to live. Not because of a temporary crisis, but because prison itself has broken something inside him. Many families spend years trying to restore hope. Sending letters, making visits, providing encouragement, trying to maintain connections despite enormous obstacles. Sometimes those efforts succeed. Sometimes they do not. And what happens next can be heartbreaking. Because prison does not merely punish individuals. Its effects often ripple across generations. One of the cruelest realities of long-term imprisonment is the gradual disappearance of human connection. At first, visits may be frequent. Letters arrive regularly. Phone calls happen often. The outside world still feels close. But years change things. People relocate. Relationships end. Family members age. Financial difficulties make travel harder. Eventually, visits become less common. Then less common still. Until one day they stop entirely. Former inmates have described the emotional impact of realizing nobody is coming. Nobody is writing. Nobody is waiting. For many prisoners, that moment becomes a turning point. Humans are social creatures. Connection provides meaning. Without it, isolation becomes much harder to endure. Researchers studying long-term incarceration repeatedly identify social support as one of the strongest predictors of psychological resilience. When support disappears, despair often grows. And for some prisoners, that despair eventually contributes to a decision that once seemed unimaginable. Mental health professionals working inside prisons have observed another phenomenon. Over time, some inmates begin losing their sense of identity. Before prison, they may have been fathers, workers, students, athletes, friends, community members. But after decades of incarceration, many of those identities disappear. The inmate number becomes more familiar than the life that came before. Days become structured entirely around institutional routines. Meals arrive at scheduled times. Movement follows scheduled times. Recreation follows scheduled times. Everything follows schedules created by someone else. Eventually, some prisoners struggle to imagine themselves existing outside prison at all. This process is sometimes referred to as institutionalization. The prison becomes the only world they know. And while that may sound like adaptation, it can carry hidden costs. Because when identity disappears, purpose often follows. Without purpose, life becomes harder to sustain emotionally. Without purpose, years feel heavier. Without purpose, hope becomes fragile. And when hope becomes fragile, the desire to continue living can weaken. Yet there is another reason some prisoners request execution. One that is rarely discussed openly. Fear of growing old behind bars. Imagine entering prison in your 20s. You are physically strong, healthy, capable. Then decades pass. Your hair turns gray. Your body weakens. Medical problems emerge. Friends inside prison begin dying. You attend funeral services for fellow inmates. You watch younger prisoners replace older generations. And gradually, a realization takes shape. This prison will be where you die. Not eventually. Not theoretically. Literally. This place. This cell. These walls. For some inmates, that realization becomes more frightening than execution itself. Execution has certainty. A date. An ending. Life imprisonment often offers neither. Only continued decline. Year after year. Many correctional systems now house growing populations of elderly inmates. Some require wheelchairs. Some require constant medical care. Some suffer dementia. And for certain prisoners, the prospect of spending decades in that condition feels unbearable. It becomes another factor pushing them toward hopelessness. Another factor pushing them toward surrender. This raises an uncomfortable question. What is the true purpose of punishment? Different people answer differently. Some emphasize accountability. Others focus on public safety. Some prioritize rehabilitation. Others prioritize retribution. But regardless of philosophy, most societies expect punishment to remain humane. That principle becomes harder to define when discussing decades of confinement. Supporters of long sentences argue that serious crimes deserve severe consequences. Critics argue that extreme isolation and hopelessness can cause profound psychological damage. Both perspectives continue shaping policy debates around the world. And cases involving prisoners who seek execution often become symbols in those larger arguments. Because they force people to confront a difficult possibility. What if imprisonment can sometimes become so psychologically overwhelming that death begins to appear preferable? Whether one agrees or disagrees with that conclusion, the existence of these cases cannot be ignored. They are real. They are documented. And they continue challenging assumptions about punishment and human endurance. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this story is that human beings respond to confinement in dramatically different ways. Two inmates can live under nearly identical conditions. One loses hope completely. The other finds a reason to continue. One requests execution. The other spends decades pursuing education, mentoring others, or rebuilding relationships. Why? Psychologists continue searching for answers. Some point to personality differences. Others emphasize family support. Some highlight faith. Others focus on resilience developed before incarceration. The truth is likely a combination of many factors. Human beings are complex. No single explanation fits every case. And that complexity is important to remember. Because reducing these stories to simple conclusions misses what makes them so powerful. They reveal both the fragility and the strength of the human mind. The capacity to break. And the capacity to endure. Sometimes within the same person. When people think about prison, they often imagine physical confinement. Steel bars. Locked doors. Concrete walls. But the stories you've heard reveal another reality. The most difficult battles often occur where nobody can see them. Inside the mind. Inside memory. Inside the quiet hours when a prisoner is alone with thoughts that cannot be escaped. For some inmates, those battles end in resilience. For others, they end in despair. And for a small but deeply troubling number, they end with a request that seems almost impossible to understand. A request for execution. Not because death becomes attractive, but because life, as they experience it, becomes unbearable. Whether viewed as surrender, consequence, tragedy, or something else entirely, these cases force society to confront difficult questions about punishment, justice, and the limits of human endurance. Questions that remain unsettled. Questions that continue echoing through prison corridors long after the lights go out. And perhaps the most haunting truth is this: the desire to live is one of humanity's strongest instincts. So when a person willingly abandons that instinct, the story behind that decision is almost always far darker than it first appears. And behind prison walls around the world, those stories continue unfolding every single day. For some prisoners, the greatest fear is execution. For others, it's waking up every day knowing they may never leave the cell they're standing in. The stories you've heard today reveal a side of prison life that few people ever see, a place where hope can disappear, where time itself becomes punishment, and where some inmates reach a point where death feels easier than another year behind bars. Thank you for watching. If you found this documentary insightful, subscribe for more in-depth explorations of crime, justice, and life behind prison walls. Until next time, stay informed, stay curious, and remember, every prison sentence tells a story far more complicated than it first appears.